Good afternoon, everyone. We are happy to be here. Thanks a lot for your time. We had a very small. Good afternoon, everyone. We had a very small technical problem with the Zoom, but we are back and happy to have you here and looking forward to have a very productive meeting event with you. And today we are going to talk about the third-party risks, and we have speakers who are going to join us as a panelist very soon. I try to bring them because really the Zoom is going to be a little bit problematic for us today, and I try to bring them as a panelist. And today we will talk about supply chain security in turbulent times. My name is Samir Aliyev. I will be guiding you today's conversation, and we will talk a lot about security disruptions, operational disruption, compliance exposure, and reputational damages are happening, and Therefore, I'm happy to invite Tom Schmidt and Roman Haltinner from EY, who is our presenting partner at the Global Cyber Conference. And our goal in this session is to move from a theory to actionable practices you can take back to your team today. So Roman Haltiner is a partner at the EY with 25 years of experience across cyber resilience and IT forensics, and Tom Schmidt, a cybersecurity leader for financial services at EY Switzerland, focusing on third-party cloud security. What you can expect today's session is that the fast-paced discussion on how supply chain, and cyber risks are evolving, practical third-party risk management, lesson learned from life science, energy, telecom, financial services, plus priorities for board and executives in uncertain times. We will reserve Q&A session for you at the end. Please post your question as we go in the Q&A button at the bottom of the windows. I will bring them in live before we close the session. We will answer all of them. And we are meeting on Zoom, so feel free to use the chat or Q&A button to share your insights as well. And yeah, also we are going to be live on YouTube right now, and we would like to start with Tom and Schmidt. And again, one more time, sorry for inconvenience that we couldn't start on time. Now we are here, and Tom and Roman, welcome, and you are welcome to share your screen as well, and looking forward to have you here. Tom?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
But we don't see you.
Don't see me. Then I will go on video.
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. Now it's working. Huh? Is it working?
We don't. Not yet. Not yet. But maybe you can share the screen, Tom. Somehow camera is not visible.
So I can't activate camera on my side.
Okay, this is strange. Somehow the Zoom is having a little bit hard time for us. We joined a little bit late, but maybe you can share your screen, start with your presentation. By the time we will try to solve this technical issue here. Roman, Tom, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, but we're now trying to share. Huh?
Or if you want, I can share on behalf of you.
Yes, please try it.
Good.
Okay, perfect. So maybe we have now the full screen. Okay, good. So let's then start. Very warm welcome also from our side. And we would like to use the time today. And as you have seen, we are in an example of supply chain security, where we now trusting in a system which is not working properly. And this also shows a little bit what kind of topic we would like to discuss with you this afternoon. I would like to, or we would like to, Tom and I would like to give you a little bit an intro in the topic of supply chain security, talking about contents, giving an introduction. What doesn't we exactly mean when we talk about supply chain security, protecting the entire supply chain? That sounds really challenging. It is challenging and includes partner and supplier systems, which is also not very easy to protect, and also to understand what kind of risks you have there. Then we will go a little bit more in detail, talking about the nature and scope of supply chain cyber risks. And as a third part, a very important part in our time, talking about regulation frameworks and industry standards, showing you what kind of regulatory requirements coming into place when we talk about supply chain security, talking about the measures and best practice, and then of course let you go after we closing the session with future considerations about the topic. Supply chain risk nowadays is a very important risk, and when we talk about supply chain risk, I'm showing also on the next page a couple of very interesting. Let's see if it's coming. So there is still no next one. When we're talking about the increasing number of expected disruptions, of course, when we looking on a supply chain, there are many factors coming into place when we talk about to secure the supply chain. Of course, you know, the natural disasters which you're facing if something is not able to deliver, is not able to supply. In nowadays, very strong topic, it's the geopolitical disruption when we talk about war, trade barriers, and in nowadays about tariffs. This also can influence our supply chain. And then we have a look on other topics like the logistic disruptions, transport strikes, container shortages. We're very well known, not only since the pandemic, we also see this from time to time, or when we have in the past looked on what's happened on cyber risks, typically and Maersk, we know that there could be a disruption of the whole supply chain very quickly and very impacted. This whole supply chain very impactful. Today we want to talking about one element of it, about the cyber attacks. Next slide, please. It's now with Tom.
Yes, also very warm welcome from my side. Tom is speaking. Happy that the technology seems to be improve over presentation time, so recovery mode seems to work. And obviously, I also would like to give you still some introductory words to the supply chain and cybersecurity and what we mean with that, basically. So supply chain cybersecurity at the end protects all the components and relationships in an organization's extended network, mitigating risks from cyber threat. So we are expanding our cybersecurity activities within the company towards our suppliers, third parties, that we make sure that we have a better end-to-end protection when we talk about the supply chain. And obviously, as you are fully aware, the modern supply chains are nowadays global, multi-tiered, and also rely heavily on digital technologies. We especially saw that also in view of COVID and what happened there, and with what importance the supply chains have from that perspective. And with that, with the digitalization, as it was also the case within the company, also with the supply chain, we see emerging cyber risks coming from there. And not only with classical IT, but also expanding into OT systems and IoT. And this all is impacting us when we talk about supply chain cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So we would like to go a little bit to the nature and scope of supply chain cyber risks. And with that, also showcasing a bit, what are we talking when we have a look at the client side, supplier side, from an attack vector perspective, but also attack target perspective. So supplier, if they are attacked directly, there might be a different attack vector and also different target compared to the end client who is getting services or delivered by the supplier in the chain. When we talk about the supplier, obviously malware infection, for example, if an attacker is able to infect the supplier, that might have a huge impact also for the clients or on the client side, so the clients of the supplier, as this can be multiplied within the supply chain itself. And that's also true for all the other attacks that you see here, like social engineering, brute forcing, but especially also exploitation of vulnerabilities in software. We have seen that several times in the past, that software providers have been infected with malware, and that software was then distributed amongst the clients of the supplier, which had a significant impact. Roman will talk about that later on and giving concrete examples on that. But it's not only about software, it's also about the configuration, or might even be hardware at the end, which is impacted by attackers and then distributed in the network, and with that also impacting the end user. On the end user side, it's the classical thing. So as well, malware infection coming from the supplier, for example, might but also be a physical attack or manipulation. Physical attack when also tampering with hardware, for example, which is then put into place. And if we look from an attack target perspective, quite often it's also the people on the supplier side. They might be not on the same level educated as on the client side. If it's a smaller supplier company, they might not have the same awareness campaigns in place when it's about cybersecurity, which might be easier for an attacker than to attack people at the supplier side instead of the end client. And as always nowadays, nation-state threats play a role here as well. They might also tampering and manipulating hardware, which is distributed. We have seen even in warfare situation that hardware is tampered. Just think about the pagers that were distributed in the Middle East, which were exploding afterwards, which is also an attack on hardware, but can also be used obviously to steal data and for other crime. And we have a complex multi-stage attacks as different people are involved in that. But going to a bit more concrete examples and handing over to Roman again.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think that's the famous example in the past where we have seen in terms of a supply chain attack. And to say this, the spectrum is very broad, but this one was one of the first examples. We really realized that there is something we have to do when it comes to suppliers, to supplier of software, so that you have additional controls, additional mechanics in place to have a better understanding. What does it mean when we see this kind of cyber attack? It was 2019. It was the SolarWind example I would like to highlight here, where you have seen impacted over 18,000 customers were using this software and have this kind of impact here. This was typically a supply chain compromise because the code was infected and were used, and then also due to the fact that you have to install as a user of this kind of software. So you implemented the whole vulnerabilities in your network, and this vulnerability was able to exploitation on a long-term side also by the attackers. So that was the typical starting point where we realized what does it exactly mean when we were attacked by this kind of cyber attack. It's not always a cyber attack. You see this on the next example, which I think it's showing exactly what does it mean when we talk about supply outages. So when we talk about cybersecurity in general, we're always talking about availability, confidentiality, and integrity. That's something we know, but when it comes very close to this topic of a cyber attack, then means also that you have to think about the whole supply chain. And in this case, it was not a cyber attack, as I said before. It was more an outages of software due to misconfiguration during a transformation of the software, of a software upgrade. And it's affected everyone here in Switzerland buying a cheese in a store. Typically, in this case, it was the issue that everybody knows and understand what's happened after the warehouses, the cheese warehouses was not able to deliver the cheese to the grocery stores due to the fact there were no information what they have to do, what they have to deliver, in which area they have to go. And there is this kind of issue was still in place until today. We talk here about in this webcast. And we also talking here about the topic we have seen that the stores and also the warehouse itself now coming by handmade processes to avoid any outages and any losses in the grocery store. So the cheese will be now delivered by another way and an additional alternative way to the stores, so that everybody as a client is able now to can buy cheese in the store. I think that's an example which is showing it's not always a cyber attack. It goes more, it goes beyond, and it goes far in the topic of supply chain resilience.
Good. So looking at some examples, and I have already mentioned one or the other aspect when we talk about supply chain cyber risks, but obviously ransomware as an attack vector is very relevant also in this case. And as already mentioned, if attackers are successfully in attacking a supply chain, a provider, then that from a managed service perspective, it also is interrupting then not only the provider itself, but also the end client. So it doesn't necessarily need to be that the end client is impacted by stolen data. It can also just be business service disruption, which goes along, even if no data is outsourced to a provider, but if the provider or managed service provider still is operating on behalf of the end client, and then those services are interrupted. But in addition to that, we also see obviously the third-party vulnerabilities, and with that, is it possible from time to time, depending also on the interconnection between the end client and the supplier, that attackers might reach the network of the end client as well. And it's quite difficult quite often to really understand what's going on at the third party from an end client perspective. So what are really the vulnerabilities there? What's going on depending on the information that is communicated by the third party to the end client? It might not be that clear, and then also taking the right decision and measures might not be that easy in that case. We definitely see the human element. As I've mentioned before, it might be easier for an attacker to target less secure employees at smaller suppliers. with phishing or social engineering, what can then be used also for attacks against the end client, as they might not be on the same level educated as the large organization, which might be the end client of a small provider. And the software supply chain attack, we have already given this example also with SolarWinds. That's one of such examples. There have been many others where updates are rolled out to the client, and with that, then also the end client is directly impacted with a service outage, or even then with having a malware within the own network, and with all the impact that is also known by classical attacks. So malicious code, definitely important aspect, not only that this might be distributed by a supplier, but even if the company is programming themselves nowadays, obviously libraries are used, existing code is used. It's not being programmed from scratch anymore, as this was in the past the case. So if already malicious code is in that software packages that are reused, also the malware sits within the own network then, which is a certain challenge to make sure how do you get really clean code if you're reusing that which is publicly available. Next page. And with that, coming to regulatory frameworks and industry standards, and Roman is kicking off that section.
Absolutely. And when you are for a long time in the cybersecurity topic, it's now also to recognize that a lot of regulations coming into place. When you have a look on this, meanwhile, European Union regulation overview, then you see there is a lot of additional regulations coming in due to the fact that we have regulations in Europe. If we also have local regulation in each of the countries in addition, that means that you need an overview about all these regulations. And I would like just to highlight here a couple of them. When we talk about NIS2, for example, which is maybe at this time the most famous. Also in these regulations, there's a lot of topics there referring to the supply chain risk and the supply chain security. When we have a look on the Digital Operation Resilience Act, DORA, therefore more focused on the financial sector, there is also highlighted some elements they have to be covered by this standard, and you have to implement additional or dedicated controls and measures to fulfill these regulations. When we have a closer look on what's going on the Cyber Resilience Act, which is CRA, which is maybe one of the latest outcomes, which is covering a lot of topics in terms of the supply chain. This will be also an interesting regulations, which is also requires very active actions from the side of an organization to also tackle the whole supply chain. Then we talk about the Supply Chain Act as such, which is the name. It's a dedicated topic. It's not fairly new, but it's coming now into the place when we talk about NIS2 and all the local regulation. Also here is not dedicated to the supply chain. Some controls required, even it's called Supply Chain Act, but there's a lot of topics when it comes to monitor and ensure human rights and environmental standards, but they also rely in some cases to typical supply chain measures to secure the whole supply chain. Next one, please. That's FINMA regulation. That's to you, Tom.
Yeah, a quick excursus into the banking side and also insurance, some of that also relevant for insurance. We have already seen on the slide before when you talk about NIS2. With DORA, we have Lex Specialis for the banking environment in the EU. So instead of following NIS2, banks are following DORA basically, or financial institutions, not only banks, also insurance companies, obviously. And in Switzerland, we also have similar regulation in place like DORA, not to the very same extent, but going in the same direction. We already know for many years the outsourcing circular, which is relevant for banks and insurance companies when it's about outsourcing system relevant or relevant functions, which might impact the business. But when we talk about supply chain cyber risks today, it's not only about the outsourcing relationships that fall under the outsourcing circular. That's really important. If you work in a bank or an insurance company, it goes way beyond that. Obviously, as we talk about the whole supply chain and not only the ones that need to be regulated through the circular outsourcing 18/3. In addition to that, from a FINMA perspective, and that's now especially for the banks, insurance companies don't have a similar circular like this operational risks and resilience circular, which is also addressing the cyber risks and also obviously the overall operational resilience aspects, which are also covered in DORA. And here also third party is and supply chain is an important aspect of it. FINMA is orienting themselves on the NIST cybersecurity framework, as you might be aware of. And also within that NIST cybersecurity framework, we have an integrated cybersecurity supply chain risk management section, the CSCRM, which is relevant from that perspective. I see we are already on the next slide, which is leading me to NIST standards, NIST guidelines. I have just mentioned one where FINMA is also taking as a standard for their own regulation. But in addition to that, there are other NIST publications like the NIST Cyber Supply Chain Guidance, which is available. You have also here the reference number if you're interested in that, which gives additional guidelines and hints. And integrating cybersecurity in risk management, which is as well as special publication from NIST. It's about cybersecurity supply chain risk management practices for systems and organizations. And also on the ISO side, we have within the 27 standard row, we have a standard which offers also specific guidance on securing or for securing the supply chain. And rather going then to the OT side, also on that in that area, we find additional standards which might be helpful for you to have a look at it and to see what you might want to apply when dealing with supply chain and cyber risks. With that, we come to the next section. So the question is a bit, what are measures and best practices to protect against those cyber risks in the supply chain? And Roman is going to kick off again this section.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the CISO is playing an important role when it comes to supply chain security. Do you think if you are in a role of a CISO, another topic I have to cover? And yes, it's from the nature, or it's past, or you can divide it from the nature role you have in an organization. When we have a look on what important is for a CISO has to have the overview of what's going on in terms of the processes in the infrastructure and all the assets he has to protect. And therefore, he needs the transparency to have a better understanding where could be a risk in terms to break the supply chain in this case. And that's why the CISO is becoming more and more not only the typical risk manager and creating the transparency, he also should get more responsibility in terms of compliance and the governance topic. Because also we have heard there's some regulation out there, they're covering exactly this area, and usually and practically it ends up on the table of the CISO first, and then afterwards it will hand it over to the compliance and maybe also to the law department or legal department. Very important here, not just to mention, is the collaboration and communication. So the CISO becoming someone who is helping to connect the people in terms also to assess the right area of the supply chain, creating the measures to covering the risks, and also is responsible to get an end-to-end view on the whole supply chain and secure them. Very important role in the future from cybersecurity. Next slide, please, is showing a bit what is it about supply chain security. And I mentioned here a couple of topics. Transparency, so you have to know the supply chain end to end. You have a clear understanding where it starts, what kind of third parties or partners are part of the whole supply chain end to end. And then have also frameworks in place, and we have seen this is not to create a new area or a new framework itself. It's all about measures around stability of the redundancy, autonomy, and polyvalence, and some elements you need to make your supply chain more stabilized. Risk management, of course, classical nature, which is part of the CISO function. It's part of a general security function. And then talking about integration. Integration means there is also something you have to put in the requirements in your contracts you have with all the third parties, all the supplier itself. So it also have an end-to-end agreement in contracts, how you protect and what kind you requires from your partners when it comes to securing the supply chain. Going a little bit deeper, more technically, when it comes to software integrity. Software integrity should be by your supplier, but also when you integrate this software in your environment, and do this in a way where if your deployment in a safe way. So you have to control that. You have to use that in a way which is a process which is stabilized and also controlled and measured by these functions, relevant functions. Vulnerability management, incident management, the typical areas you have to have in your organization, but think also about to include your suppliers, your partners in processes like the incident response process. When we talk about the supply chain resilience framework, it's just mentioned here what's the different. When you have a look on the whole security framework you have in place, I would just mention here two elements. They are a little bit different to the framework you are using mostly in our days. You have to really have a look on the supply chain itself. The transparency I mentioned before, all these kind of things you not have to do, and we know it's challenging. There is also technology out there which you can use to get the better transparency in the supply chain. So you have to understand how this looks like, and very often you also have to map the supply chain to data and technology. So we have a typical capability model here: supply, data, and enabling technology. It's not people, process, and technology. Even there are also behind that, but that's just showing you a little bit or give you an idea how this supply chain resilience model can looks like. Next one, please. That's it.
Good. Yeah, thanks, Roman. So a couple of thoughts around supplier selection and contractual protections. Probably that's not really new to you, but it's still important that is stringently followed, even if it's not rocket science at the end. So it always starts with a proper due diligence. So be aware what your provider can offer from a security perspective, just checking if they are even able to follow your requirements when you talk about cybersecurity, which might not be the case depending on the size of the supplier and compared to the own requirements you have set within your own company. So important aspect, and in practice I quite often see that this is not necessarily done, and there are some surprises then later on if you are already in full swing of business. Then contractual protections. Obviously, if you have concrete requirements on your side, also make sure that this is reflected in the contracts with the supplier. There are always difficult situations where that might not be easy or not even possible. So also thinking about the hyperscaler the big cloud provider, probably it's difficult to change contractual agreements because they have their standard contracts. But even then, you still have the possibility to better understand what is really covered, what is not covered, and what you need to do in addition on your side to have an end-to-end view on cybersecurity. Therefore, that clarification is really important, and bring it into the contracts to the extent possible. Then ongoing compliance verification. So check on your side. It's as always, also with the outsourcing. Outsourcing is not meaning also outtasking the responsibility. Responsibility is staying with you. You need to know what's going on, and you only can be in the know when you also have some compliance and verification with your suppliers. That might be on specific controls, on incident notifications, and also the compliance throughout the supply chain. So on the next slide, we see a couple of aspects that need to be considered when we talk about monitoring, surveillance. So if we talk about continuous monitoring, it's not the meaning that you do that every second, any minute. Continuous rather in the sense of that you do it very regularly and not just once a year. So depending on the importance and the impact that might have your relationship with the supplier, you should do that more often and get a good understanding of the measures in place and how the security posture is really looking like at your supplier. And what should be standard nowadays, that you have a right to audit, even if you are not taking this right too often, but it should still be there. Otherwise, you will have lengthy discussions if you really want to do an audit and if you don't have that in the contract. And it should also be clear who is paying for such audits. Otherwise, that discussion might also come on along when you want to do such an audit that you have to pay or they have to pay. So that needs to be clarified up front. Certifications give a certain indication, right? Don't get fooled by certificates. If someone is ISO 27001 certified, it doesn't mean in itself a lot. It really depends on the scope and also on the statement of applicability, which controls are really in place covering that scope, and what is the content of the audit reports that are then performed. And even then, it's still about information security management system. It's not really going deep into the single controls. If you want to get a better understanding, if controls that are in place are also operating effectively throughout a period of time, then we are ending up in the last of those bullet points in ISO 3000 SOC 2 reports, where at least you get clarity on the very specific controls. You still might face a situation that not all the relevant controls from your point of view are part of such a report. Then still additional action is necessary, but at least for the ones that are in the report, you get a statement if that control worked as intended over a certain period of time, if it's a type 2 report. It only works with type 2 report. Type 1 report is only design effectiveness and is not giving really a lot of additional assurance. Going to the next slide. Incident response, it's a fact that nowadays you have to train internally as well, crisis management, incident response, how the processes are working internally, and this needs to be expanded to the supplier as well, that you also have an end-to-end view from that perspective. You might need some stakeholders at the supplier that are part of your crisis team and supporting you during a severe incident. Also the communication, as you have to communicate from a supplier perspective, but also you as an end user. As I said, the responsibility stays with you, and when it's about informing the regulators and so on, it normally needs to be done by you as the end user and not the supplier. And also contingency plans. So do you have any chance to have alternative sources if there is a business interruption on the supplier side, or is your business as long down as the supplier is down with his own processes and business? So very important aspects that should be considered as well, already upfront in due diligence, but also when we talk then about the controls environment. And last slide from that perspective, some technical principles are also supporting us in getting a better view from the suppliers. So thinking about zero trust, obviously in a cloud environment, that's nowadays more or less a given, as the architecture is also heavily supporting zero trust, but that also helps obviously for protecting the whole supply chain to the extent it is possible. It's not the easy task, especially if you have many different technologies in place, then it's not the easy thing to apply zero trust, but it should at least be part of your thinking when setting up something like that, and to see to what extent that can be implemented as well. What we see still rarely, but it's coming more and more, is the software bill of materials, as an abbreviation also called SBOM, which is helping you to better understand which libraries are part of software you are buying. For example, that if there is a vulnerability with a specific library, that you are aware that software you have internally in your company is also using that library, and then you can obviously act much faster than if you are not aware of that. So there have been in the past as well good examples where that was really an issue, that the companies didn't know where such piece of software is already in place, which is vulnerable, and what exactly needs to be done. So Log4j is a good example of such a situation. And therefore, to have more transparency, it's good if you get that additional information, and that's always something you should ask for. Maybe your supplier already can provide something in that direction, that you have more visibility. And on the end user side, always important, I mentioned it before, if you are reusing software code in your own applications that you develop, that you really do thorough source code security scanning. There are different analyzers out there. They are not going to find everything, but it's much better than doing nothing. And in practice, I quite often also see that this is considered optional. So depending on the developer, they can use such a tool, but they are not forced to. And I think good practice nowadays is that you really need to scan, that this shouldn't be optional, and that this is one of the strong controls if you're using third-party software libraries in your own code as well. And maybe you have seen recently in the press in a Linux environment with a packet manager, which have been infected, the packets there, which are then distributed and downloaded, so with npm packets. And this is also a classical supply chain attack. So attacking or changing already the source code where it's getting distributed to all the clients and all the users of a specific operating system, for example. Good. With that, we reached the main part, and we would like to share some future considerations. And for that, I'm handing over to Roman once more.
Yes, and we are conscious of time. We would also like to give you the opportunity to ask questions, and we'll be very fast and quick and talking about facts here. Supply chain security, as we heard, is a strategic corporate risk. So you have to take this up to the top level. It requires cooperation between IT, procurement, management, and suppliers. And as you also heard, CISO is becoming in the corporate environment more and more important, and a risk manager behind all that facts. And the goal of the whole thing, when we talk about supply chain, is creating trustworthiness and the resilience. And of course, the transparency helps you to get a secure supply chain. Take in addition and take it with you, there is a lot of regulations coming in, and have a look on that. And what it's also the case that this regulation raising the bars for the companies to implement a proper security, because there is also a system behind this, thinking about fines of consequences if you are not comply with these regulations, and helps to build a trusted ecosystem, as we also heard when we talk about measures. Recommendations from our side: company must treat supply chain security as a strategic board level topic, that's for sure. And also starting to consist your risk management, creating stabilized, clear governance structure so that you have a proper collaboration with your partners and your suppliers in place and become a long-term resilience end-to-end business. That's from our side. Thank you very much. And now I think we are open to ask question to us and we respond as good as we can.
Thank you very much, Roman. Thank you very much, Tom. I'm happy that we could manage the technical difficulties here through the Zoom channel, and we are here. We finished the presentation, and I have some questions already for you that I would like to read and get your insights. The first question is so that what is changing most in supply chain cyber risk in last 24 months? What are the main changes, most changes?
So maybe I can start, and Roman, feel free also to add, obviously. So I think it went much more up the ladder of attention in the companies. So we've seen, especially also looking a little bit from the financial services perspective, since a couple of years now, the banks and the insurance companies also need to report cyber incidents to FINMA as the regulator, only with a certain severity. So not all the cyber activities or incidents, but if they reach a certain severity. And if you look at the risk monitor from FINMA, where they are talking about what they are seeing in the market, they are indicating that more than 50% of the incidents that are reported by the banks and insurance companies are in connection in one way or the other with supply chain and third parties. And this has significantly increased compared to 24 or even more months ago. And with that, obviously, also the awareness is raised that there is additional element that companies need to take care of, and it's also raising attention on management level and not only with the people directly dealing with that, and therefore more and more controls, especially also when you talk about controls reporting like ISO 3000 or SOC 2 reporting is coming into play. So we see more and more reports also from the providers issued to the benefit for their clients.
Yeah, maybe add to this topic also when we have a look on the industrial clients, definitely ransomware attacks, and they're well known since many years. Meanwhile, they also give an example or showing awareness to companies due to the fact that ransomware was attacking some backend systems like ERPs, SAP, and so on. That heavily interrupted the supply chain when it comes to factory and so on. And this was a real driver also for management and also boards to discussing the supply chain topic, security topic at this time. And in this year, we have a lot of these discussions also with organizations exactly about what does it mean when one of the factories or other production line will be disrupted by such a kind of a cyber attack.
Thank you very much, Roman and Tom. I have another question that we talk most about, or you talk most about third-party security risk management, but there are also fourth party and fifth party, let's say so. How do you get real visibility in the fourth and fifth party dependence and concentration risk?
Yes, maybe I can start. And I also mentioned before, yes, these dimensions means that you have to also to think a little bit about your approach. So, and when you have a look on, and I'm just directing in the direction of using technology, using AI and so on, there are tools in place and there are also methodologies in place to exactly covering this aspect. And as we know, when we talk about end-to-end transparency, and that's why transparency is so important, you need technical support to understand these risks and also the measures you have in place. So when we talk about, just as an example, an asset management or an asset directory, so you also have to understand in detail what kind of supply chain relevant data and technology is part of this asset register at the client side. You have to create a landscape end-to-end of the supply chain to understand and to create the right the measures to protect in all dimensions.
Tom, do you have any additional?
Yeah, it has also something to do a bit with trust. That's always difficult, right? But nevertheless, so you are also to a certain extent trusting your own supplier that he behaves like you have agreed in with their own suppliers again as well. And it's getting more and more difficult the further away you are, obviously, as you mentioned, when you're talking about fourth party, fifth party, sixth party, and so on. But it already starts with some hardware supply. So if you're ordering cables, USB cables, then obviously it makes more sense to order them at the supplier that you already know, which might be located here in Switzerland or Europe, and not ordering there somewhere in Chinese over a Temu channel or whatever you can do, because you never know if there might be also chips in a USB cable which are just leaking your data at the end. Nowadays, almost every cable has also a chip in. So who is telling you that that chip is really doing what it is meant to do, right? And from that perspective, it's already depends a little bit how you behave yourself. And it might be good to understand what is the chain of suppliers to a certain extent, and not just starting yourself to order somewhere where you don't really understand who is part of that supply chain there.
Thanks a lot, Tom. You also talk about due diligence during your presentation, that you need to also get a certain evidence. Which kind of evidence you would suggest us to require from the critical suppliers, especially, and how we can validate them, especially if the supplier is a big organization, bigger than us. How can we validate the information that they provide us?
So maybe I can start and Roman can add again. So I was talking about the ISO 27001 certification. Quite often that's a hard requirement. Companies are asking from the suppliers, especially in the IT field, right? That might be one element that gives you at least some indication. What I'm a little bit laughing sometimes or being astonished about the situation if procurement then is just doing a checkmark exercise. So a certificate is there and therefore the requirement is fulfilled. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. If you really want to understand which controls are part of the information security management system at your supplier, you need to get additional documents and not only the certificate itself. So I was talking about the statement of applicability you need to be aware of, but also audit reports that are issued by the company who is issuing the certificates at the end. And the same also for other control framework. So obviously, when you do due diligence, you need to understand what is the control framework at your supplier. But then you would also like to get some evidence that they are really following these controls. And I think for that, it's nowadays not the best, probably, or not absolutely covering everything, but a good option to have such a SOC 2 report, for example, which is concentrating on security controls, and where at least you get the understanding by an independent party if those controls they are showing in the report are also working as intended. And as said, there might still be missing some controls which are very important for you. Then you need to initiate some additional work yourself to get that covered as well, right?
Here you go. We also see Roman.
Yes, flying blind since an hour and now I see everything, including the slides.
One more question from audience again. For government organizations, most of the mentioned laws that in your slides are not applicable. How to raise the topic to the board level anyway? I believe this board level most probably in government organizations.
Roman, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I think when we talk about board level and the government, let's take governance, government as a topic. I think we have a couple of examples. What does it mean exactly in Switzerland if some of the supplier are not able to protect their product on the government side? I think that's a lot of awareness what can happen, and this also leads then to the discussion when it comes to boards or any other boards, I would say. Not that typically when we talk about the industry. So also for here, it needs clear awareness training, and also to make them aware and to show in a transparent way what the department, for example, many suppliers, they belongs to this kind of organization, to just give them an overview and make it transparent like a sketch and so on a map, to see how independent or dependent an organization is when it comes to supplier. So the supplier landscape is always showing exactly what kind of risks it's comes with that, and this also raised then the bar for an understanding of on their side that they have to take this up as a risk in the risk management process. I think that's an important element which we have seen a lot, the awareness on the board side, and the board side is now becoming more and more aware on that, because the most of the cyber attacks we see now are more or less causing from suppliers.
Thanks, Ramon. Roman, we are coming to the end of the session. I have last question for you, and then we might close the event. We talk about the evidence, we talk about the contracts as well, and which are the three negotiable clauses belongs in every supply chain contracts or data processing agreements. How do you enforce them? Three non-negotiable clauses that should be there, and how do you enforce them?
So if the question is what should be there, that really depends a bit on the situation the company is in which sector it is in. If there is a regulator, they need to follow as well. So I think for most of the companies, the protection of the data is definitely an important element, and therefore controls and clauses around that need to be in place as well. And this is also an ongoing discussion if you just take the hyperscales, right? With all the development you have seen on that side over the last couple of years, from coming into Switzerland, having a data center in Switzerland, then the question who can access that data also from abroad. Is it possible for US people to access the data, or is it really the boundaries within EU or the European area? And all that discussion is always in connection with confidentiality of data. And it's sometimes hard to really make sure that you can bring that to the contracts to the extent you will like to have it, because it depends also on the working and operating model of your suppliers. And if you really have an issue with that, then probably you shouldn't go there. It's at the end still your decision. But I also understand the market pressure. Everyone wants to be in the cloud nowadays because of other reasons as well. So it's really a trade-off to the control framework, to the trust you get from the current environment, to what you are willing to give up on your side a little bit from 100% security, which is not in place anyway. Even if you're hosting all your data in your own data center, you don't have a full or 100% security that data is not getting stolen there, right? So it might be sometimes quite theoretical, the discussion, But that's what is happening when it comes higher up in the hierarchy, also in companies, obviously. Then all that comes into place, and it's not just about technology, but also somehow the security feeling of the people at the end and what they want to achieve with it. But you should always negotiate your own requirements with your supplier, that they fulfill the same level of security as you expect in your own company. And if you achieve that, then you are on a good level. If not, then the question is, are you still willing to go into that business relationship or not?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Roman. Before we close the session, do you have one takeaway for our audience that they listen us also live on YouTube? One takeaway before we close the session.
Maybe I can start. For me, when we talk about supply chain resilience or resilience in general, when you have to analyze a system end to end, I think the first step is to create the transparency. Get an understanding how this looks like, how this works, get an understanding about the risk, and then choose appropriate and effective measures. Not everything what you can do, but you should do what you can.
Thank you very much, Roman and Tom.
Just a short one. Be aware of what you are doing if you go in business relationship, right? Keep your eyes open and make sure that your requirements are fulfilled from a security perspective, and that this is in written format there and not just oral agreement.
Great. Thanks a lot, gentlemen. It was a great pleasure to host you and looking forward to welcoming you at the Global Cyber Conference as a main partner of the conference, presenting partner of the CISO Awards. This year we are going to have a great evening again at the Dolder Grand, and we will have further discussion on this topic as a keynote speaker from Roman on the stage, and we have 2 roundtables with you, and it will be a great event again together with you. Thanks a lot for your trust and partnership, and for our attendees, thanks a lot for your time, that being here, and one more time apologize for the delay at the beginning that happened through the technical issues. And you will get slides from EY team during the week, and you can then check all the slides and information that you have seen today during this live session. Have a lovely afternoon, and you can rewatch also the video on the YouTube later on. It will be available if you just rewatch it or share with your colleagues and friends. So Tom and Roman, thanks a lot. Great to have you here again.
Thanks a
Thank
lot,
you very
Samir.
much.
Bye.